Hello, and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak, and today I am on the Antietam Battlefield to bring you this episode. Today is, well, the first day of the year, January 1st, year 2025, and let me wish you all a happy new year, and I hope 2025 will be even better than 2024, and I hope you will stick with this channel throughout the year. And if you're not already a subscriber, please show this channel your love. Give me a big, huge thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so I can continue to bring you more episodes and more reports on the American Civil War throughout this new year. Well, I'm here on the Antietam Battlefield today to talk about a significant event that took place on this date in American history. I'm speaking about what happened in America 162 years ago today. January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln kept his promise to himself and to his cabinet, and it was 162 years ago today that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm on the Antietam Battlefield because it was here that Lincoln used the victory for the North that took place on September 17th, 1862. You know, this battlefield seems so peaceful. You got the Antietam Creek going through it, and it's hard to believe that this battlefield is home to the bloodiest 24 hours in American military history. When you add up the casualties between North and South, no other date in American military history surpasses September 17th, 1862. The carnage here was incredible. But Lincoln used this battle as the means to change the war from a war to preserve the Union from the Northern point of view to a crusade to free the slaves. And there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception about the Emancipation Proclamation. And so let's take some time to look at the Emancipation Proclamation and what did it do exactly. So please let me take you around the Antietam Battlefield and explain this very significant document that really does change the course of the American Civil War. The tall monument behind me is dedicated to Sergeant William McKinley, who fought here at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. If that name sounds familiar, it's because William McKinley, Sergeant McKinley, would go on to become President McKinley and lead our nation through another war, that being the Spanish-American War in 1898. And unfortunately, McKinley would meet an untimely demise in Western New York when he was assassinated in 1901. Now, when the war begins, the South opens the hostilities in April of 1861 when they fire on Fort Sumter, and to the South, the war was about states' rights, and I will be able to add more evidence to that later on in this episode. And in the beginning, Lincoln does not think that this is going to be a long war. Remember, at the start of the war, he asked for only 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. He thinks this war is going to be over. But when the war is entering its second summer in 1862, Lincoln begins to consider altering the course of the war from one of preserving the Union, but adding to it the idea of freeing the slaves. And he will first broach the idea of emancipation to some of his cabinet members in July 1862. On July 13th, 1862, Lincoln first broached the topic of emancipation to two members of his cabinet, Secretary of State William Seward and Navy Secretary Gideon Welles. And 9 days later, on July 22nd, he would bring up the topic of emancipation to his entire cabinet. And I guess to somewhat of Lincoln's surprise, he was not met with overwhelmingly favorable support for the idea of emancipation. At that meeting, Lincoln said he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation effective January 1st, 1863. However, there were some members of the cabinet that were not overwhelmingly in favor of Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, either at the federal level or at that particular time. Secretary of Treasury Salmon P. Chase did not favor a national emancipation, but thought emancipation should happen more at the local level. And Secretary of State Seward did not think the timing was right. You see, at that point in time, the war was going really in the South's favor, and the North was really struggling, to put it mildly. It's July. McClellan's army had been beaten back on the peninsula during the seven days battles, and things were not going too well in the West either, even though earlier in the year there was the great Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh. Secretary Seward really prevailed when he told Lincoln that while he personally favored emancipation, the timing was not right. At that point in time, in July of 1862, it would look like the last shriek on the retreat. So at that point, Lincoln tabled the idea of emancipation, hoping that there would be a great Union victory sometime shortly down the road. And Antietam, while not a great Union victory, was victory enough for Lincoln to revisit the idea of emancipation. So with Lee's army back in Virginia, or at least the bulk of his army back in Virginia, Jeb Stuart will do a raid into southern Pennsylvania, and he will be in the Cashtown area. That is documented, and that'll be a whole nother episode to talk about later. But with Lee's first invasion of the North over, Maryland is safe, Pennsylvania is safe, with the exception of Stuart's cavalry. Lincoln uses this opportunity to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And let's take a look at that, because that will add evidence that the war, at least to the South, was a war about states' rights and not a war about slavery. Behind me stand two monuments to two Pennsylvania infantry regiments. The 100th Pennsylvania, and a little further off in the distance there, the 45th Pennsylvania. So let's take a look at this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued on September 22nd. And what it said basically was he was giving the South until the end of the year, till December 31st, 1862, to lay down their arms and come back into the Union. And they can keep their slaves. That issue would be decided in Congress. And let's take a look at what the South's reaction was to that. I think we know it already. The South rejected Lincoln's offer. Now, here was an opportunity to end the war, to end the bloodshed, to avoid the carnage of Gettysburg and hell that was 1864. The South could have laid down their arms, returned to the Union, and, according to Lincoln, kept their slaves. Now, the North doesn't like to talk about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation too much because it did allow the South to retain slaves. And we want to think of the Emancipation Proclamation as this document that freed all the slaves, which we're going to find out in a few moments didn't do that. So this is more proof that the war to the South was about states' rights and not about slavery. But there's an old saying, the victors get to write the history books, and the North won the war. So, well, be that as it may. So the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was rejected, probably also bolstered by the fact that in mid-December, the South handed the North a crushing defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was met with stony silence by the South. The war would continue. Lincoln, on January 1st, would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's take a look at that document. Let's see what it did, and more importantly, what it didn't do. We want to think that Lincoln is the great emancipator, that when he took ink to paper on January 1st and signed that document, that he freed all the slaves. Well, no. If you actually read the Emancipation Proclamation, it doesn't. And what I'm about to tell you is what I used to tell my students when I was teaching at the college level. That document did not free any slaves in Maryland. It didn't free any slaves in Kentucky. It didn't free slaves in Missouri or New Jersey or Delaware. It deliberately excluded all the counties in Western Virginia that in about 6 months would make up the state of West Virginia. And it deliberately excluded slaves in certain parishes in Louisiana. Louisiana doesn't use the word county, they use the word parish instead. It's basically the same thing as a county. So, who did it free? Well, you have to remember one thing. Lincoln is a trained lawyer, and he's not 100% sure that he has the power to end slavery. He believes that only Congress has that authority. But he is commander-in-chief of U.S. military, and he believes that he has the authority to free slaves as a war measure. He doesn't believe he can free slaves in areas where the Constitution has been restored, basically areas that the U.S. military controls. But he believes he has the authority to end slavery where there's open rebellion and the Constitution cannot be enforced. So basically, he frees all of the slaves in open rebellion, in areas that are in open rebellion to the United States where the United States has not regained control. So, to put it simply, the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, essentially freed no one, because the South was not going to pay any attention to some decree by someone they considered to be a tyrant president in Washington, D.C., who had no control over them. They weren't paying attention to him. So, in theory, the Emancipation Proclamation freed millions of people. In reality, on January 1st, 1863, it freed no one. Now, over time, as the U.S. military would gain more control over the South, it would essentially free people. But on January 1st, 1863, the reality is it freed no one. And again, I want to emphasize this, it did not free any slaves in areas where the U.S. Constitution was in effect. Did not free anyone in Western Virginia, Maryland, the rest of the border states, Delaware, New Jersey, which also had slavery at the time. Didn't free any of them, because Lincoln did not think he had the authority to do that. And that's why it would be very important as the war was concluding, to pass a constitutional amendment that would actually free the slaves permanently. Let's take a look at the reaction that there was to this Emancipation Proclamation. Reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation in the North was not universal 100% positive. However, there were certain segments of the population that welcomed the Emancipation Proclamation with open arms. I'm standing in front of the state monument to Massachusetts here at Antietam Battlefield, and overwhelmingly the number of soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, particularly those from New England and Massachusetts, welcomed emancipation. In fact, well, some of them even thought it was a little late in coming. But they were not alone. Horace Greeley, who was the founder and editor of the New York Tribune newspaper, had this to say. He described emancipation as, quote, "the beginning of the end of the rebellion, the beginning of the new life for the nation," end quote. Abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner said, quote, "the skies are brighter and the air is purer now that slavery has been handed over to judgment," end quote. But the opinion of emancipation was not universally accepted by all in the North. So let's take a look at some of the Northern opposition to emancipation. General John Porter, who commanded the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac here at the Battle of Antietam, was supplying information to opposition newspapers in the North, and he had this to say in regard to the Emancipation Proclamation. Quote, "It was resented in the Army, caused disgust, discontent, and expressions of disloyalty. All such bulletins tend to prolong the war by rousing the bitter feelings of the South." As for the men fighting in the Army of the Potomac, again, that varied from soldier to soldier. The soldiers, as I mentioned, from New England were pretty well in the majority in favor of abolition, in favor of emancipation, but there were those who were not in favor. And I'm quoting now from the book Landscape Turned Red, which was one of the sources I used for this episode. And in this book, author Stephen Sears quotes an unnamed source as saying that they would love to hang Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, that some of the men in the Army did not support emancipation. And again, an unnamed source, he quotes as saying that the emancipation was met with denouncement among the men of the Army. They do not wish to think that they are fighting for Negroes, but to put down the rebellion. After the South was defeated, that would be the time enough to talk about the damn Negroes. Now, there's one big question mark that still needs to be answered, and that is, what was the opinion of the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George B. McClellan? Major General George McClellan was a staunch Democrat who, at the beginning of the war, made his opinion about this war very clear. Let's take a look at the opinion of Major General George B. McClellan. At the start of the war, McClellan confided in a friend that he wanted to dodge the question of the Negro. Well, he actually didn't use the word Negro. He used a different word that started with the letter N, but I'm editing it here for television. And that would remain McClellan's position really throughout the war. Publicly, after the Emancipation Proclamation, or at least the preliminary one, was issued, McClellan said he would support whatever decision that the administration made, although I don't think he really desired to do that, but at least that's what he was saying publicly. And I think that is going to have some ramifications for him, basically his earlier statement, because he made it very clear throughout the war that this was a war to preserve the Union and not a war, or should I say, not a crusade, to free the Negroes, to free the slaves. On October 1st, 1862, President Lincoln paid a visit to the Antietam Battlefield. There was many reasons for the trip. One was to meet with the Army of the Potomac itself, meet its soldiers, greet them. And most people think it was to try to prod General McClellan into pursuing Lee's army into Virginia, and that probably was the main reason, but it was also to get a lay of the land on how the army and its commander felt about emancipation. And Lincoln would spend 4 days here, and after meeting with McClellan and reviewing some of the troops of the Army of the Potomac, he would leave with probably just as many questions as he came here with, and very few answers. But we do know this. The first two casualties from the Emancipation Proclamation would be General John Porter, who would be ostensibly court-martialed for his actions at Second Bull Run, but most likely also because of his opinion on emancipation. And General McClellan would also have to go. In early November, he would be relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac for a second and final time, never to return to the command position again for the duration of the war. No doubt McClellan was also let go because of the fact that he just could not get on board with the concept of emancipation, at least as a war effort. So what can we take away from this? Well, we do know this much, that when Lincoln took pen to paper and signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he theoretically freed millions of slaves, and in reality freed none of them. But it gave the war a new focus. England, which had been toying around with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation with the right to exist, backed away once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Coincidentally, no foreign nation ever did recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation with a right to exist. And England backed off because they just morally felt they could not side with a country that was promoting slavery. That's the main thing about the Emancipation Proclamation, is that it changes the course of the war. One, from preserving the Union to a crusade to end slavery. And that is the big difference. And that's why people today think the war was entirely about slavery. It wasn't. To the South, in my opinion, and the evidence supports what I'm saying, that the war, they went to war for states' rights to create a new nation. The North, their war aims changed over time. When Lincoln came to Antietam for those 4 days in October of 1862, he didn't deliver any great speeches. It was really, in many ways, a fact-finding tour. And as I previously mentioned, he didn't find out much in the way of facts, at least from his Army commander, George McClellan, in terms of how he felt about emancipation and what he was going to do next. But he spoke about emancipation 13 months later when he was at Gettysburg. When I think about Lincoln's famous speech he gave at Gettysburg, what we call the Gettysburg Address, I'd like to think that he was not only speaking about the soldiers who died at Gettysburg, but soldiers from the North throughout the war, whether they were at Shiloh or on the Virginia Peninsula, Second Bull Run, or even here at Antietam, Sharpsburg for my southern viewers. When Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. That new birth of freedom was emancipation. Now, I've taken a good amount of criticism from people who think that, a couple of comments that were quickly pulled down, that I supported slavery. I don't support slavery. Slavery is a sin that shall ever mar this country. And my wish for 2025 is that slavery that still exists in the world, and according to humanitarian groups out there, slavery is still in existence to this day in different parts of the world. I don't ever want slavery to return to this country. I want what Lincoln wanted and what Martin Luther King wanted, that we judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That hopefully one day we will rise above looking at people for what they are and judge people instead by who they are. Are you a good person? Not what is the color of your skin. Are you decent? Do you treat your family well? Do you treat your neighbors well? Do you treat yourself well? I want to thank you for watching. I hope you'll continue to tune in throughout the course of the year. For Civil War Reports, I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. Please stick around for a few more seconds for a special dedication. The flag here at the Antietam Battlefield is flying half-staff for the recent passing of former President Jimmy Carter. I'll be the first one to say he was really not a very good, effective president. I was about 9 years old when he became president, and my family didn't have much nice to say about him, but the work he did after leaving the White House is without a doubt some of the finest work one man could do. Humanitarian efforts to bring peace around the world and building homes for Habitat for Humanity. In the opening days of Civil War Reports, I did a special report on how President Carter used the Gettysburg Battlefield, how he used our battlefield to break the ice and help broker a lasting peace between Israel and Egypt, what has become known as the Camp David Accords. As I said, President Carter, unfortunately, was not a very good president, but he was a great humanitarian. And in that episode, I asked that President Carter be the first U.S. president to live to see 100 years old as his reward for using our battlefield to help bring about that peace. That request to the good Lord was answered. President Carter lived to be 100 years old. He turned 100 on October 1st, 2024. Passed away December 29th. President Carter went home to be with his beloved wife, Rosalind, for whom he was married to for 77 years. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button. Give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends. Let them know about this channel and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.